See that.
Yeah, I saw
Okay,
that. I'm also recording now. So,
perfect.
okay.
Okay, so I'll get started. Hi, today me and my team will be arguing why the US should prioritize adaptation to climate change rather than fight climate change. A nation that is stronger in the face of rising sea levels, extreme weather, and shifting climate. So, hi, I'm Onyx Smith, and we'll be discussing the ongoing climate change. It is important that we reevaluate our strategies and consider an important shift. So, moving on to my first point, which is increasing climate related disasters. So, the frequency and severity of climate related disasters in the US have been on the rise. So, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the number of billion-dollar disasters in the US has been steadily increasing over the past few decades. In 2020 alone, there were 22 such events, including hurricanes, wildfires, and severe storms, totaling over $95 billion in damages. So wildfires have been more frequent and severe in many parts of the US due to combination of factors including warmer temperatures, drier conditions, and increased fuel loads. The western United States have been particularly affected with large destructive wildfires becoming a regular occurrence during the summer and the fall seasons. So, for example, the 2020 fire season in California alone burned over 4 million acres of land, making it one of the most extreme fire seasons on record. So, overall, the increasing frequency and severity of climate related disasters in the US underscores the importance of prioritizing adaptation. Moving on to my next point, it's economic benefits. The World Bank estimated that climate change could push over 100 million people into poverty by 2030. So, if no action is taken to adapt, the Global Commission of Adaptation reports that investing $1.8 trillion globally in five key areas of adaptation between 2020 and 2030 could generate $7.1 trillion in total net benefits, which leads me to my next point on cost-effective solutions. Um, so in short terms, adaptation can be more cost-effective strategy. An immediate measure to protect against extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and changing precipitation patterns can save lives and resources. These measures provide tangible and immediate benefits while working towards a long-term and sustainable solution. In many cases, adaptation measures can be more cost effective. Oh, wait, sorry. Going back to like the economic benefits, adaptation can stimulate economic growth and create jobs. So investments in infrastructure such as flood barriers, green spaces, and drought resistant crops not only enhances a community but also creates like employment opportunities. Um, Investing in adaptation can also uh, create jobs, and then sorry, and then in conclusion, um, prioritizing adaptation is not a fight against climate change, rather it is a strategic and effective approach. It allows us to fight and um, while presenting laying the groundwork for a sustainable future. So embracing adaptation as a proactive and empowering response to the challenges we face. It is very urgent for us to adapt. So it's important for life, communities, and our economy. In the face of the unknown, our approach is not passive, but it's proactive in the challenges we face today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sophia and I'll be doing your cross examination. So the first question I have for you is you talked a lot about like the number of like disasters increasing and all the billion-dollar disasters increasing, but I didn't really hear you talk much about like what we can do to adapt to those. Like how do you think we would adapt to decrease like the number of the wildfires and stuff like that?
I think we just need to find like more solutions. for like climate change. So once we like find more solutions for that, that will start decreasing the amount of like wildfires and like natural disasters.
Do you have any specific examples?
Well, I talked a little bit about like there's like early warning systems and then like creating like climate resilient infrastructures and then like improving like dryland agriculture. So like I don't know if you researched like early warning systems, but it's basically um is like a mechanism designed to detect and alert like individuals organization to like um stop like the risk and the threat before like it escalates. So it's just kind of like warning people before like it happens, basically.
Okay. And then my next question, you said that, or you mentioned that adoption was like more cost effective. And I was just wondering if you had any examples of how it would be more cost effective than fighting climate change.
I don't have like specific examples, but it's kind of just like by like the facts that I've given, it's kind of just states that like it's more cost effective and it's gonna be more easier like in the long run than in like the short run, basically.
Okay, thank you. And then also, you also mentioned how it can create like a lot of employment opportunities. And I was just wondering if you think that like fighting climate change could create those too, because I was just thinking about like my research and how climate change, like obviously like switching to sorry, one second. Switching to renewable like resource and stuff would also create a lot of job opportunities. So I'm just curious on like your thought on that.
Yeah, I think definitely both sides could offer more job opportunities. I just think that like when you're I don't know, I just think both sides like there could be more job opportunities. I don't think there's like a negative to that. But yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, so my name is Caitlin, and I'm the second negative speaker. Okay, the richest 1% of the population emits as much planet heating pollution as 2/3 of humanity. In other words, they produce as much carbon pollution as 5 billion people. And this was revealed in an Oxfam report in November of 2023. One of the biggest misconceptions about fighting climate change is that it requires too much time and resources, but I will explain why this is not the case. And today, our team is going to be arguing for why we should fight climate change rather than adapting to it. This is beneficial in a timely sense, economical sense, and I'm going to be explaining how to execute this plan of fighting climate change. And later on, our team is also going to explain how we are going to limit these types of emissions. So first, we need to hold those accountable, that those who like emit the most carbon emissions, because their actions have impacts on the entire planet. For example, according to CBS News in November of 2023, these emissions of the richest 1% cause 1.3 heat-related excess deaths each year. And this is largely caused by ground level ozone, which is created from vehicles, fossil fuels, and other like sources of fog, according to the Department of Ecology in the state of Washington. For example, these ozone attacks affect lung tissue and worsen asthma, um, along with other lung diseases. And holding the rich accountable will make a big impact alone, because like strictening laws to prevent them from like emitting more does not require too much additional funding or resources. Specifically, the government could hold stricter carbon caps and taxing them proportionally to how much greenhouse gases they are emitting. We need to put a price on carbon, because the impacts of climate change come at a cost. According to the Europe Tax Foundation, in Europe, Carbon taxes are levied based on different greenhouse gases. For example, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluoride gases. So this means it's totally doable for the US to stricten up their carbon taxing laws and expanding carbon caps to span across other greenhouse gases. And this means like as more countries catch on to charging for emissions through carbon taxes and other like emissions, greenhouse gas emissions will decrease immensely like as a whole planet. This means that like the rich will be more conscious of how much they are emitting. For example, they'll take less private jet rides, and this will make way larger of a difference, like bigger of an impact than us like making really small lifestyle changes for like changing from plastic straws to like paper straws. Yeah, and before we find alternatives, we should find where the most greenhouse gases are coming from. And the NPR mentioned that adaptation is not a long-term investment. So this is because through adapting, we have to keep like spending more and more money depending on the like what the newest extreme event, like weather event is. So in the long term, if we spend too long like focusing on only adapting, we're going to be only losing money because it's going to be hard to like keep catching up. Secondly, focusing on adapting comes with setbacks economically and with time. According to the Biden-Harris administration team, extreme weather events caused by climate change will cost the US over 150 billion in reparations each year. And putting all our funding towards trying to adapt will mean that there's no like progress in trying to put an end to climate change. Currently, the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency is given a funding of only 2 billion out of this 150 billion. And the EPA works to provide clean energy, strengthen climate resilience, and also just like building community. And this is why I think they should be getting more funding. This is also backed up by the Council of Foreign Relations. By diversifying the energy systems we use, this will help us shift from mainly using fossil fuels to more sustainable energy practices like hydro, nuclear, and solar power. So this funding of more sustainable practices can be found through increasing the EPA's budget, and this will directly slow down the speed of climate change. To close off, choosing to prioritize climate change is the right decision because it makes more sense to lessen the greenhouse gas emissions at the source. In this case, it's large corporations and the elite 1% who are emitting most of the greenhouse gases at the moment. And by increasing the EPA's budget, we can diversify sustainable energy practices. And through the points I've made, I've proven there does not need to be crazy technological advances or like, yeah, just for us to fight climate change. With the resources the US has right now, we have a chance to undo all the like pollution we've done in the past. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a few questions for you. So you kind of talked about like policies and stuff like that. So how do you think climate change policies or actions could impact industries or communities like negatively?
Sorry, could you repeat the question one time? I can like.
Yeah. So how do you think climate change policies or actions could impact industries or communities negatively?
I think mostly it'll affect them positively because in the long run, climate change comes with more negativity, which will be like fought through fighting it. The only downside maybe is that it might take a little bit of adjusting for large corporations, but since technically they are businesses and they're receiving a lot of revenue each year. It shouldn't be too hard for them to fully adapt.
You probably already stated this, but how do you think they should put a price on carbon? Because I know you talked a lot about like carbon and like how in Europe there's like they put like a price on carbon. So how do you think that we should do it here?
Currently we already have like a cap and trade system, which is basically like um businesses putting a price on carbon, and like depending on what the market price is, they like that's how much they charge, because each like large corporation has a cap on how much they can emit already in the US. So what I'm like proposing is that the US can just like stricten up how much like they're allowed to admit, or just make it more expensive so they're more conscious of their budget.
Okay, perfect. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I am the second affirmative speaker. Okay. As the impacts of climate change continue to manifest across the globe, the need for adaptation strategies become increasingly urgent. While mitigation undoubtedly remains an essential process in addressing climate change, prioritizing adaptation should emerge as a primary focus for the US alongside other countries. Today, I will be going over 3 points on why we should prioritize adaptation over mitigation. The first point, we are at the point of no return, making it imperative to shift our focus towards adaptation and supporting developing countries. My second point, immediate actions allows us to protect lives that are most impacted by climate change. And my third point, adaptation strategies are crucial for building resilience and minimizing the devastating impacts of climate change on communities, economies, and ecosystems. So for my first point, we are at the point of no return, which makes it imperative to shift our focus towards adaptation and supporting developing countries. In a quote by NASA in their article, "Is it too late to prevent climate change?" they state, "Humans have caused major climate changes to happen already, and we have set in motion more changes still. However, if we stop emitting greenhouse gases today, the rise in global temperatures would begin to flatten within a few years. Temperatures would then plateau, but remain well elevated for many, many centuries." So this quote from NASA shows that we need to put a complete halt on greenhouse gases in order for us to alleviate any climate change and have the global temperatures to start flattening. I just wanted to emphasize on the fact that it only flattens the global temperatures. It won't reduce any of the natural disasters going on, but merely plateaus the temperatures, and the so-called climate crisis will continue until a few centuries afterwards, when the temperatures actually start to decrease. And then to even get to the point of zero emissions will be a challenge in itself. In 2021, the US produced 6,340 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which is around 14 trillion pounds, according to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. To expect the US to diminish and stop the production of greenhouse gases is a plan that will take many, many years in itself. And if we connect this with my first quote, this just shows that we need to collectively stop emitting greenhouse gases. And when we finally get to that point, it will take centuries before we even see the benefits to our mitigation techniques. This brings me to my second point. Immediate action allows us to protect lives that are most impacted by climate change. Climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable communities and nations that have contributed the least to greenhouse gases. The rich that contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions can easily pay their way out of it and not have climate change affect them. According to the National Library of Medicine, the poorest and least powerful people already live in a situation with poor water supplies and sanitation, which is compounded by natural disasters. Although these vulnerable communities have tried to adapt, it is clear that there's a limit on how much money these developing countries have. Therefore, we need to help them, as we are the reasons why they are suffering. In my last point, adaptation strategies are crucial for building resilience and minimizing the devastating impacts of climate change. If we plan to accomplish if we plan to accomplish anything, we must act fast. If we decide to go with the prioritizing mitigation route, as I explained in point 1, we wouldn't see any outcome until many, many centuries later. In addition, according to Sammy Adler in her article, How Much Would It Cost to End Climate Change? She states, estimates of how much money it would take to end global climate change range between 300 billion and 50 trillion over the next 2 decades. While the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, on the other hand, says adaptation needs in the developing world are set to skyrocket to as much as 340 billion a year by 2030. Yet adaptation support today stands at less than 1/10 of that amount. The most vulnerable people and communities are paying the price. This is unacceptable. These 2 quotes just show that we must act now. We need to start adapting as soon as possible before it gets too late, before the prices start skyrocketing. In the World Economic Forum, in their article, they give many adaptation strategies that we can start adopting and help vulnerable communities adopt too. These include infrastructure resilience, which is building infrastructure that will be able to withstand the changing weather patterns, such as constructing roads and bridges to withstand higher temperatures and more powerful storms. Another strategy would be crop diversification. This includes switching to drought-resistant crops and implementing agriculture practices that are more resilient to changing climate conditions. And lastly would be coastal protection, reinforcing coastal defense systems to protect against sea level rise and coastal erosion. In conclusion, the urgency of climate change adaptation cannot be overstated. As we confront the realities of a warming planet and the irreversible impacts of past emissions, it becomes clear that immediate action is necessary. Prioritizing adaptation over mitigation, particularly for the US and other developing nations, is paramount. Okay.
Okay, so I have a few questions for you. The first one is that how will you convince like people in the US or the people just like in charge of funding or budgets to use our funding to help other countries when we have so much already going on within the US?
Okay. Half of my point is like also we need to help like the natives in America, help them adapt too, because they're also low funds and they're also impacted um, by climate change. And then as for developing countries, I'm not sure how we would persuade the government um, to fund the developing countries, but it's just a plan that we should have since the US produces a lot of carbon emissions, which then affects these developing countries. So in a way, it's like our fault and we should take accountability for it.
Okay. And then when helping these like vulnerable communities or like developing countries,
Yeah.
what should be our first step? Or like what should the US do like once you get people to agree?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, I stated my like ways we can help them adapt. I think the most important would be the resilient infrastructures, since that would be most important because climate change, or yeah, it would be most important since it would like reduce the cost of like if natural disaster strikes and wipes out like the infrastructure, it would be cheaper. Yeah.
And then my last question, in the beginning, you mentioned that we should like make a halt on just the greenhouse gases in general. How will you like convince like the really large corporations to just like switch from using like oil and like fossil fuels to like fund or like yeah, just to use those?
Okay. Yeah. Well, that point was for like why mitigation isn't possible, because in order to mitigate, we need to reach zero net emissions in order for us to see any benefits. So that wasn't a point like for adapting, it was more for like why mitigation is not possible. Because if we don't reach like net zero carbon emissions, the mitigation, like the things we do for mitigation won't have any effect, because it would still be like temperature would still like be increasing if we don't reach net zero carbon emissions. I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna be the second speaker. So, hi, my name is Sophia again. I'm going to be continuing my group's decision on why we should be fighting climate change rather than adapting to it. So, we all know that climate change is continuing to happen. It's not ever going to just stop at this point. So, all we can do is continue to fight it and not just settle for adaptation or adoption and just give up. So, building on my teammate Caitlin's points of reducing carbon emissions, I'll be going into greater depth on how we can limit these emissions and like what we can do, as individuals to try and fight climate change. So, the three main points that I'll be discussing and expanding on are changing things in our daily life, using renewable energy sources, and using the land differently, and becoming more aware of how we're using the land. So, for my first point, I'm going to be going into lifestyle changes. So, changing things that we do in our daily life might seem like a small change. In a small way, we can fight climate change, but if everyone were to do this, then it would make a really big difference. And then I'm going to start off with my article from the Department of State. So, we all know, I know it's been said already in this debate, but we know that the goal is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So, in order to do this, we need to keep fighting climate change, and we can't just give up and settle for adaptation. And then a very common like excuse of like why we can't fight climate change, I feel like that I often hear is like that it's super expensive and like we don't have the funds to do so. But that brings me to Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And basically, this was the largest investment in climate and energy in American history. So saying it's too expensive is not really a good excuse of why we can't fight this climate change. And then another thing we can do that kind of builds onto changing things in our daily life is trying our best to switch from regular vehicles to electric vehicles. And then from my source, my academic journal from Martini Agnigni, she stated that internal combustion engines operating on fossil fuel oil produce about 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So this just shows really how much like regular combustion engine cars are damaging the planet. And it's also, she stated that it's a lot of people are like, well, there's an argument on if electric vehicles are truly better for the environment. But so although like making the battery for these cars can is like polluting the environment as well, over time they generate very little emissions like throughout their lifetime. So it actually like in the like full extent of their lifetime, they do use less emissions, or like they do produce less gas emissions than regular combustion engines. So it would be beneficial to us to switch from regular vehicles to electric vehicles. So I'm going to go into my second point now of renewable energy. So we know about many of these renewable energy sources, such as solar, wind, hydropower, biogas, geothermal, things like that. So we need to start implementing these and not just like kind of looking over them and continuing with our routine of just using other energy sources that are non-renewable. So one of these things that we can do is replace coal and oil consumption with natural gases, and other renewable energy sources that we can use include carbon capture and storage, hydrogen fusion technology, and nuclear energy. And then obviously like rooftop solar systems and solar farms and things like that. And then in my article from the Drying Tech Academic Journal, they do argue that, like, some scholars may argue that solutions to change mitigation already exist. And so it's a matter of really scaling them up to achieve these climate goals. So obviously we need to actually like take action in this and become a part of it. Otherwise, if we just like keep saying like, okay, we're going to do this and then it doesn't happen. So yeah, so we can use all of these technologies to try and do this. So an example that we could do are that we could do things such as fluorescent lighting, low water usage devices, and reducing the consumption while meeting industrial, residential, and commercial energy demands, and things like that. And they also mentioned this in my other article from the National Library of Medicine, how, like, in order to prevent individuals from just either like not doing this or like there being like a rebound effect, we need to do things like there needs to like people need to become more aware of like the incentives that exist like within this process, because obviously people are selfish and like have their own personal benefits, and like it's more convenient to not use these things. But by like there's a lot of financial incentives that will like save them money over time by using these sources, so people need to become more aware of that. And then my third point is using the land differently. This is something that I think is very overlooked and people don't really think about it, but we're always changing the landscape to like, or the landscape to fit our needs, such as like taking over land, destroying it to like either make farms or things like that. And so we're constantly destroying like agriculture and, or not agriculture, just the land. So from my article, the World Wildlife article, um, they state that agriculture is responsible for about a quarter of kind's greenhouse gas emissions. And with that said, 1/3 of food grown is never eaten and instead goes to waste. So things we can do, we really need to have businesses to start shrinking those carbon footprints by ensuring that their products are being used. So by doing things like really making sure we're only like producing enough for enough that will get used and not get waste, not overproducing, as well as like businessmen can make sure that their product that they're creating isn't contributing to cutting down any forests or destroying habitats that like are in that area. And then farmers and ranchers can also use climate smart methods such as planting cover crops, using more precise and efficient irrigation, and producing enough foods for everyone, but also not overproducing. And then things we can do that can be super beneficial, that is just super easy, is like when you go to like the store, you can look for the FSC label. And the FSC label means that the product you're buying is coming from a forest that is managed responsible. So by altering things in our daily life, such as what I said, doing things to make sure we're like benefiting the environment instead of harming it, or not benefiting, but trying to not harm it, is going to make a positive impact on the environment, as well as switching to renewable energy sources to reach our net goal of zero emissions by 2050. And lastly, becoming aware of the way we're using the land and doing things like buying these foods from FSC labels is a great way to reduce our negative footprint on the climate and change the issue and fight it firsthand.
Okay, I have a few questions. So your last point was talking about food waste. Food waste has been a problem for like the longest time now. How do you plan on getting this business to start changing? Because they had like such a like longest extent of time to change, but they've never have. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay, yeah.
I do agree that it has been a problem for a long time, but I feel like it hasn't. I don't know if it's really, I mean, I'm sure it has, but I feel like at least I don't hear much about it. Like it's just kind of like dismissed. So I feel like doing things to like really like make people aware of this and like maybe like almost like create more regulations for it or something like that to help reduce this.
Okay. And then another question, you mentioned that we should reach net zero carbon emission to net zero by 2050. How likely do you think this is?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how likely this is. This is just the goal that has been set. But I do think that by continuing to try this fight against climate change, that's the like best thing we can do to reach that, and it's the like only way that we will ever reach that. So I think it's important to keep trying to reach that, and hopefully we do.
Okay, and then in the beginning, you stated that climate change will be an everlasting problem. So what is the point of like fighting for climate change when nothing's going to come out of it when we can just adapt right now?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, okay. So in like your first point, you mentioned that climate change is going to be like an everlasting problem. And so what is the point of fighting for climate change when you can just start adapting now and helping vulnerable communities adapt?
Yeah, so I think that climate change is always going to be partially an issue because we're always using resources and stuff like that. But I think that there's a way that we can fight it to definitely reduce it. And maybe in the future, eventually, that won't be an issue or such an issue. But I think that just choosing to adapt to it is kind of a way of like giving up, and it's kind of like the easy way out. And I don't think it's necessarily like super sustainable because I think that like we're always going to be having issues and they're always going to be like, oh, we need to adapt to this now. We need to adapt to this now. Whereas I feel like if we fight it, then we're really like getting to the bottom of the problem and we're changing our ways instead of just like creating more issues by continuing our bad ways.
Okay. And then one last question. You mentioned that we have enough money to fund towards fighting climate change. How would you persuade the government to actually put the funding towards fighting climate change? Yeah.
Well, I stated that one second that about the Biden Inflation Reduction Act. And so that should fund a lot of like the fighting climate change.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, for this next part, we have to, so I want to prepare a little bit. So if you guys are down to like lower the volume, that's like that's kind of how we do it. We just like, yeah. So we can talk, and then whenever you guys want to talk, we can lower our volume so we don't hear your guys' points. If you guys are cool with that. I think I'm next, no? Yeah. Okay. Just making sure. Okay. And
Okay.
I'll put it in the chat when we're ready. For the other team there. Okay. So I need your guys' help for what was that one point you said, Annika, about it was like $1.8 trillion between some 2018 or 2020. What was that
Here,
point?
let me
Oh,
pull it up.
I want to
Sorry.
like reiterate that.
Okay, let me find it again.
Also, me and Patrick did like the same points. It's like perfect, like
Oh.
because I talked about like resilience and like
Uh-huh.
developing countries the most, like the vulnerable
Yeah.
countries. So like I feel like whatever I was writing down stuff that you said, and I'm gonna like kind of bring up a little bit more of like the points that I have as well. So I'm gonna try and tackle the whole like rebuttal right away. And so
Okay.
just and then kind of like because I don't want to forget the arguments as I'm going.
Yeah.
And then I'll talk about
Yeah.
okay.
That works.
Which one? What point are you talking about, Mike?
You said
Because I
something about
talked a lot
like
about money.
1.8 trillion something, and then it ended
Oh,
up
okay.
coming out.
So
Yeah.
the Global Commission on Adaptation reports that investing $1.8 trillion globally in 5 key areas of adaptation between 2020 and 2030 could generate $7.1 trillion in total net benefits, which leads me into my next point, which is about like cost-effective solutions.
Leads to you said 1.7 trillion?
7.1 trillion.
Oh, other way around. Okay.
Okay,
Damn.
so no,
Damn.
yeah. Okay, so investing is $1.8 trillion globally in 5 key areas of adaptation between 2020 and 2030 could generate $7.1 trillion.
Just between those 10 years. Okay.
Did you want to just copy and paste that into the group chat?
Oh yeah, that
Yeah.
probably would have been easier.
Yeah, I'll just look over and read that. I'll kind of just restate that. It was by the global. You're gonna restate. Yeah, I'll just read it.
Yeah, there you go.
For sure. It's a global commission. Okay, cool. And then yeah, so I have my own points. There was some things that you guys couldn't answer, and I was like, luckily, I think I'm gonna come back to them and answer them. So like for example, like when they were like, what are some examples? It's kind of hard to think about that on the spot.
Well, yeah, and I was like, I kind of gave like a few of them anyways, but I don't know.
What was one of
No,
them?
you're
Oh, it was like
good.
what was some? Yeah, creating like infrastructure. Oh yeah, you did mention that you're like creating
Like
resilient.
like early warning system, like resilient
Yeah.
infrastructure and like stuff like
And
that.
I have examples of that. That's actually one of the points I have as well. So I'll like
Okay.
bring that up again.
Yeah.
I
I was
also
gonna
love
say.
how what?
Oh no, never mind. You're good.
I was gonna say I love how they were like how will like adaptation like processes convince countries to like use less like like coal and gases and stuff. And it's like that's
Yeah.
like not our focus, It's like that's kind of like what we're not doing here. We're not like we're trying to adapt. We're trying to like do our own thing now, like so then like we're able to
Mhm.
like be resilient. So I'll bring all that stuff up. Do you think there's anything else I should talk about? The electric cars? Oh yeah.
Yes. Well, I just think I don't know. Wait, I don't.
I said switching from gas-based vehicles to electric-based cars. It is kind of it ties into the vulnerable communities a little bit as well because
Oh yeah.
it's kind of like the point that we talked about that actually they talked about too is like putting stricter laws on people that are like the rich people because like
Mhm.
they're able to afford their way out of like greenhouse gases and like climate change whereas developing countries can't. It's kind of the same thing like if we're like trying to switch to electric vehicles the developing countries won't be able to afford that like that's it's only going
Yeah.
to be the same effect over time and I think that it's only gonna happen, like it's only gonna change if we help them. So I think for that point, I'll just say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just because
Because I can't
I
debunk
never
that on the
really like.
spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's good.
I've done research on electric vehicles in the past, but that was like last year and I forgot all that stuff. Anyway,
And I always thought like electric cars were like worse for the climate than like
yeah.
because
Oh
it's
yeah.
taking up like more. I don't
I
know.
think for
It
that
does
one,
Taking
it's
up.
damage.
when you mine for the lithium, it actually does more damage to the earth.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah,
And
because it
it
causes
does
more pollution.
and there's like electric grids too, obviously, that are able to like sustain those like electrical current. That's why we have like poles and stuff that like lead back to
Yeah.
those grids. And I've done research and it says like that those grids are like gonna be overworked. Like they're gonna be too much stress and strain on those grids to where it's like we can't even support like a community full of only electric based vehicles. So
Hmm.
again, I don't know, maybe I can bring that up at some point as well, but I don't know. That's yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to. It's kind
But
of
mining
whatever
for
you want.
lithium is a good thing. I think I might say that. Mining for lithium is worse. Okay. All right. Well, I'm ready. I'm gonna go into it now.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay, let's put in the chat.
I don't think we
okay.
really need to. We don't. I think we don't need to have the
The
2
talk.
minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can go.
Okay, cool. All right, so my name is Joaquin. Again, we are I'm doing like the rebuttal last point here of the adaptation and why we should adapt and not mitigate. The way I go about this is I like to point out some of the questions that you guys brought up to my teammates earlier and answer some of them if they couldn't, and kind of also talk about the points that you've made during your talking points. So one of the first things I do want to bring up that my teammates brought up was the $1.8 trillion being invested into, well, sorry, I'm gonna actually bring up the whole point of the global commission on adaptation reports that investing $1.8 trillion globally in 5 key areas of adaptation between 2020 and 2030. This is 10 years that we're investing in it, can generate $7.1 trillion. So I think if we're talking about the economy and how we can afford this, or what are the benefits in terms of money or financials, I think that this is like probably the best statistic that we have at the moment in terms of why adaptation is the best. I think that this statistic shows that we're showing almost like 5 times the amount that we're putting in, and its outcome is going to be obviously put towards adaptive processes. So that's something I wanted to talk about, and also some examples that you guys were talking about. What examples could we provide in terms of what adaptation is exactly? And that's like a pretty common concern. That's a pretty valid point on why you'd be concerned about that. And I'm going to talk about this more a little bit later as well, is creating climate resilient infrastructure. And I'll talk about this in my point about a sewage system, I think in Malaysia, that was like super effective. And also employment opportunities. I think this is something my teammate also pointed out. And I'll mention more about the social justices, because I think this is also a factor that we have to take into account for adaptation. And also, I wanted to respond to switching to gas-based vehicles to electric vehicles. I think this is like pretty interesting. I haven't heard this point before, but I think that this is actually, in terms of mitigation, not really the way to go. I think that when we talk about vulnerable countries, developing countries, the point that we make to protect them and help climate change adaptation for them is to help fund them and to help with their, the money that they don't have, that can't support themselves. But if we're switching to electric vehicles, this is something more like expensive, and it kind of is counterintuitive if you think about, if we're going to switch to electric vehicles, we're basically going nowhere. I think that when you bring up the stricter laws on the rich people, because they're able to kind of buy their way out of climate change, whereas developing countries can't, it's kind of the same thing, but instead more of what we're trying to switch into. So I think that, yeah, that's a pretty important point. And yeah, funding developing countries is something you guys also asked, and I think that I'm gonna talk. I keep saying this because I'm gonna get into my points in a bit, but the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Climate Pact, or the COP26, this is an actual like, this is proof and actual an agreement that was made to basically put those efforts of developing country or developed countries pledging to increase financial help for adaptation in developing countries by like 2030 or 2025. That was the point. So yeah, those are all my responses to you guys, but I want to get into some other points as well. A lot of them have to do with what you guys actually talked about as well. And one of them was like a lesser known part of climate change adaptation is actually like social justices. The essentially means that the worst of climate's effects can harm communities that are most vulnerable and prone to disaster. With mitigation, there is such an emphasis on large scale change that there is really no focus on other parts of what makes it so important. Taking care of the climate on a lower levels and working up. Oh God, my phone. Taking care of the climate on lower levels and working up is less ambitious, more realistic, and completely ethical. I have a quote here from somebody from the Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity Committee, is saying that it is the poor that actually suffers the most when there is environmental injustice, and it's the poor that stand to benefit the most from energy revolution. And I think that this is exactly like where we need to start for adaptation. is kind of working our way up. I know that there's no way to reverse climate change, but we need to make sure that if we're going to be able to adapt, that we're all on the same level first. Like that's only ethical, like I said. We need to add more of a focus on education, equity, equality, and science, and make less of a focus on the pressure of doing work from a local level by the people struggling. Also, this is something that that I wanted to bring up for mitigation is like there's this pressure to show those change or to that everybody should be putting in work. You know, everybody has to be doing their part. But I think that less of that pressure should be put on people, especially in developing countries, because this is something that it's just going to take too long. And also, it's too much of it's too ambitious to think that everybody's going to, you know, to really play their part each and every day. So I think that what we need to do is kind of focus on things that we can control, like, you know, putting in more education in countries, funding these countries. So yeah, and obviously there's some cases I mentioned in my points here that there are like places in Minnesota, places in New Orleans that are like that have actually had to like pay the damages for it for effects of climate change. There was like some massive increase in paying homeowner insurance rates that went up to like 68% after the effects of weather, i.e. the climate. So it's already showing that like this is something that developing countries can't even afford. So again, that's the end of the point there for the vulnerable side of it. But I also want to talk about the proof, and this is my last point, and resilience. Proof and resilience is a big thing for adaptation. I think that for mitigation, it's always about what are we going to see in the long term? Like, what is it that we can do now to fight climate change that we'll see later? But adaptation is always of like, what can we do to like what processes can we make that will improve over time and basically like make our lives more comfortable, because obviously there's no going back. And I think that one thing that helps people is reassurance. So proof of actual infrastructures or implementations working. One of them was a quote. I have a quote here from the IMF.org saying the stormwater management and road tunnel, smart tunnel in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia serves a dual purpose. It carries traffic and helps combat flash floods. The tunnel consists of 3 levels. Normally, the top 2 levels carry road traffic. It has cost about $500 million. The smart tunnel is expected to prevent more than $1.5 billion in flood damage. So again, another economic statistic right there. But it's also a developing country too. So to know that there is being help from developed countries putting into this, and also that they're being able to afford it and implement it, and also it working, is already proof of that adaptation and some level of some, you know, some strategies that we're trying to put in are already working. So yeah, and also just building resilience as well. I think that on a smaller scale, you know, putting in those like implementations as, you know, respective to the places that are struggling. So for example, some places are more prone to flooding or more prone to droughts, implementing our own ways to adapt to that, to those respective places is going to show just resilience over time. And I think again, it's going to be a cheaper process. So yeah, I hope I answered all your questions. I hope I wasn't going on for too long, but yeah, that's it for me.
All right, thank you. My name is Luke, and I'm gonna be doing the rebuttal for the mitigation side. So to start off, one point that was mentioned earlier, this was at like the way beginning, was how the increased frequency of forest fires is a reason for why adaptation should be like the way that we approach climate change. However, I see it that that frequency of forest fires could much easier or much quickly be reversed if we used mitigation, because waiting for adaptation like that strategy to finally set in against forest fires, that's going to take a pretty long time, because like was mentioned, 2024 was, or 2023 was like had the most forest fires in a really long time. So it's going to take a long while for that to finally be reversed. But if we used a mitigation strategy, it would put like a sizable dent in that issue like right now. And my next point is that we both agree that this is a change that needs to be addressed immediately, but the mitigation approach would be able to do things much sooner than the adaptation approach, because mitigation would be able to put climate change back to like a much closer point of like zero. Then and then we can figure out what to do from there. But adaptation would be a much more drawn out process, and it would be very difficult to like actually see any sort of change. And that would also probably be if that, like you've said, like Joaquin said, that you need to see proof of it happening for people to kind of change their minds. And if you are very slowly seeing gradual change, no one's really going to notice that too much. So that's not going to go well for an adaptation approach. And that's why I think that mitigation, you could see like immediate change, and it'd be easier for people to get behind that. And my next point is talking about the issue of poverty and how there's a serious issue with that. And then going back to how adaptation would be able to give jobs to people, it would gradually give people jobs because we need to adapt to this right now. We need to adapt to that. But a mitigation, since it's like a full force kind of like push to reduce the amount of climate change that there is, it would put a lot of people back on their feet economically right now instead of in 10 years or 15 years or something like that. My next point is how adaptation will constantly be trying to catch up to the state of the environment because, oh, there's a drought somewhere. Now we need to adapt to that. But mitigation would be able to prevent that drought from even happening in the beginning. And it will, like the mitigation approach is constructed to deal with the current state of the environment and stop the immediate problem at the source rather than dealing with what happens and then kind of trying to change and form some sort of strategy to deal with that issue. And finally, to summarize my team points, like the biggest points is that funding the EPA with much more money would be able to do so much and a lot of good things in preventing climate change. And then also scaling up the currently active mitigation approaches would be the correct stance to take against the climate change issue. And that is all that I have. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, I'm gonna stop my recording now.
Same.
How?